Why don't we go ahead and jump in? Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining our call today to talk about regional tribal governance. My name is Kristi Williams. I'm Gwich'in and Yukon from the interior of Alaska, and I manage Calista's government relations. I'd like to welcome our guest today. Joining from Calista is President and CEO Andrew Guy, Board Director Willie Kasayulie, our General Counsel Walter Featherly, and Calista's DC lobbyist and former Seneca Nation President Rob Porter. We would like to welcome our special guest today as well, President Richard Peterson of Central Council, Tlingit and Haida Indian Tribes, along with Holland and Knight attorney Phil Baker-Shenk. We appreciate everyone taking the time today for this important discussion and hope the recording helps people to better understand regional tribal governance in Alaska. Why don't we go ahead and jump in with the questions? I know everyone is very curious about whether or not there are regional tribal governments in Alaska, and what is a regional tribal?
Phil, you want to jump in here on and talk a little bit about the Central Council, and then I can follow up and say a few words about the Arctic Slope Native Association?
Sure. There are currently 2 regional tribal governments that are recognized as that in the state of Alaska, recognized by the federal government. One is the Central Council of Klinketh and Haida Indian Tribes of Alaska. They were formed in 1935, or recognized in 1935, I should say. And the other is on the Arctic Slope. And Walter, you can describe them better than can I.
Yes, sure, Phil. And on the Arctic Slope, it's actually an illustrative example because there are 2 regional organizations on the North Slope, regional tribal organizations. One is a recognized tribe, and that's the Inupiat community of the Arctic Slope, which is a regional tribe. The members of that tribe are all of the Inupiat residents of the North Slope region. It was recognized as a federally recognized tribe pursuant to the Indian Reorganization Act, and it exists as a regional sovereign government for the North Slope. And as I mentioned in my opening comments, there's another organization there called the Arctic Slope Native Association. That is actually a nonprofit, but it acts as a tribal organization because it has received supporting resolutions from the village tribes, the 8 village tribes on the North Slope. But it itself is not a sovereign government. It's not a regional government. It's merely a tribal organization. So that's the situation that we have on the North Slope of Alaska.
That's a very helpful distinction you drew, because Klinketh and Haida has labored under a misimpression similar to the one that you described has coexisted on the slope, Arctic Slope. For many years, some people in BIA thought that Klinketh and Haida was not a tribal government, but they were instead a nonprofit. And that even led to a crisis for the tribe in the early to mid 90s, when the Assistant Secretary of all people decided to strip Klinketh Haida off of the list of recognized tribes that was published then periodically. And so Congress had to step in and clarify that, yes, indeed, Klinketh and Haida Central Council is a regional tribe. It has continued to exist since 1934 as recognized by the United States. And by statute, that status was confirmed by Congress. But it was quite a journey. President Peterson has heard those stories many a time. All the citizens of the tribe were alarmed at the prospect of being unrecognized, as it were, by a stroke of a pen. And Congress, thankfully, including the Alaska delegation at the time, willingly went along with correcting that error on the part of the BIA.
Fantastic, thank you both. Jumping into our next question, what does the structure of a regional government look like in practice?
Well, I would defer to President Peterson on this. I can say that the Central Council Klinketh Haida has a constitution. The constitution sets out its structure as a regional government. Delegates are elected from communities throughout Southeast and also Anchorage, and also in parts of the lower 48, California, and Washington State in particular. Members all vote a delegate to an annual tribal assembly, which then acts as the governing body in between the sessions of that larger governing body, the tribal assembly. There is an executive committee or council that actually implements the day-to-day duties of the governing body of the tribe, and the tribe has, through that election process, elected officers, including President Peterson, who is with us today. And Mr. President, do you want to describe more about how the structure works for Klinketh and Haida?
I think you summarized it very well, Phil. So we, by population, elect delegates in our communities. They then, once a year in April, travel to Juneau to enact in our tribal assembly. When they're not convened, our executive council and myself, that are elected every 2 years, have the powers of the collective tribal assembly.
Thank you for that. Rob, would you like to add anything about the proposed Yukon Kuskokwim RTG?
Thanks, Kristi. The draft constitution, has a similar mechanism that allows for the direct vote of the people of the region. The interim regional tribal government is contemplated to be created by the tribes themselves, and that they would select delegates to serve on the interim regional council. And then the very first important responsibility for the interim council is to schedule the election, to work with an interim clerk to go through the development of a tribal roll, but to make sure that all of the people of the region who wish to participate, people who are currently members or citizens of tribal governments already, have a voice in the ability to select the very first president from the region and the elected officials for the regional tribal council.
Terrific, thank you for that. And whose idea was it to form a regional tribal government in the Yukon Kuskokwim region?
This is Willie. In actuality, I think the generation of my father's group started talking about establishing a regional organization to represent the tribes out here in the YK Delta. That was how the Association of Village Council was formed, but as a nonprofit. So in the latter mid part of 1980s, a group of us started talking amongst ourselves to look at the possibility of establishing a regional tribal government for our region. We conducted a series of public forums to get an idea of how the structure would be entailed. And based on that, the Ute Nation organization was formed with a constitution, and the group itself, when I left, was in the process of establishing its bylaws. At the time, I believe, can't remember his name. He's a well-known tribal attorney in the state of Alaska that assisted the group in developing the concept of a regional tribal government. It kind of fell on the wayside, so the discussion of the tribal government has gone back as far as early 80s up to this point.
There's another effort in the region that has been around for a few years as well. Can you tell us if the effort to form the regional tribal government is different from the Nunavut effort, and how?
I think they're both similar in concept. I know that the Nunavut group has talked about the possibility of allowing a referendum by the villages that support the Nunavut group, of which the same concept under the regional tribal government that we discussed when we drafted the constitution itself for the regional tribal government.
Great, thank you. Does anyone else have anything else to add to that?
Yes, while the Nunavut and the RTG effort have the same end in sight, having a regional tribal government, the structure planned for the RTG is different from the structure that was planned for the Nunavut effort. The region is huge with 56 villages, tribal entities within the region. And many of the communities that we have are spread out. So that provides or has some challenges for the entities to overcome. And realizing the challenges that are in place, the RTG effort has a structure in place that can be a bit more efficient and less costly in terms of implementing. So while the two have the same end in sight, the approach are a lot different.
Thank you, President Guy. And can you tell us what role did ANCSA serve in regional governance?
Well, when ANCSA was being proposed, it came about because of land use issues arising in the state. Number one, from the state itself, having been formed and selecting lands, and then oil having been discovered on the North Slope, and the oil companies looking to get leasing or other title to those lands for development. So that was the impetus for ANCSA to protect the land for Alaska Natives. And in the formation, the corporations, both regional and village corporations, were formed to take ownership of that land on behalf of all of the natives, the shareholders, with two main mandates given to all of the corporations. One was to make money, and the other one was to provide for the socioeconomic improvements for the communities and shareholders that its village and regional corporations served. The one thing that was lacking was the authority over those lands, governmental authority. And with the passage of ANCSA and the duties given to the corporations, the tribal entities that we had were kind of left out in the cold. And the role that and the tribal status of those entities was in question for a long time after ANCSA was enacted.
Thank you. That's very helpful information. And can you tell us, why is Calista engaged and invested in the regional tribal government formation effort?
Okay, listening to the board of directors' vision for how the region should be in terms of addressing access mandates and our own peoples and tribal organizations' desires.
That's terrific. Thank you. And this, again, is another Calista question. What has Calista done to support the effort to form a regional government? What has the investment entailed?
Well, we first got involved in 2014 with the ask of the board to get this process rolling in a formalized manner. And with the approval of the budget in 2014, we were able to begin that process in 2015. And by the process, I mean bringing all of the tribes into one place to start having a discussion on what our tribal entities and people would. That was the regional committee effort. In that effort, we brought in all of the tribes, the village corporations, and all of the regional entities of the region into one room and started those discussions. And the first question was whether or not we wanted to form a borough, like many of the other regions of Alaska have done. And the resounding answer was no to that question. The other question was whether or not we wanted to stick with the status quo. And the answer to that question was a resounding no again, just because of the many issues that we face and the worsening statistics that we've been experiencing since ANCSA was formed. So that left a couple of questions on the table. One question was whether or not we should strengthen an existing nonprofit organization. And while that did have support, it did not have the kind of support that a regional tribal government would had. So that was the task we took in 2015 after all of those meetings we had with the regional leadership.
Thank you, President Guy. Director Kasayulie, you are the chairman of the Corporate Governance Committee at Calista. Can you tell us your thoughts on why that effort in 2015 did not succeed?
I believe the initial discussion in drafting the Constitution at the time included the ANCs into the structure itself. With some of our people with the knowledge that the tribal government can only succeed with the support of the tribes and with an understanding that ANCs have a responsibility to work on the socioeconomic status of our communities. That constitution was far more extensive, and there was a whole lot of questions from the communities whether the ANC should be part of the regional tribal government, including the nonprofits that were existing in our region. When we discussed the regional tribal concept a couple of years ago, we removed the ANCs from the draft constitution and to focus on the tribes themselves to be more involved in the development of the regional tribal government. I think one underlying question that many of the tribes had was they are already recognized individually as tribes by the Department of Interior. Whether their sovereignty would be impeded or not was a question, but I think one way that we resolved that question and issue, which is still being questioned today, is the tribes themselves, if they're recognized by the Department of Interior as a tribe, will remain as federally recognized tribes with the authority to govern themselves.
Thank you, that's great insight. And why do you think the tribes in the region have in the past have supported the formation of nonprofit associations more so than looking to form a regional tribal government?
When I first started getting involved in the Association of Village Council President as its director and eventually as chair of the group, many of the elders that were within the organization were part of the initial discussion and startup of Avcp. So many of the elders that were on the board of directors had a lot of knowledge of the needs of our communities. And they were very forceful in their strength to address many of the issues that we were facing on the village level, even to a point of directing their dissatisfaction towards the state and federal government to many of the issues that we were facing in our smaller communities, such as subsistence and many of the social issues that our membership were facing.
Thank you. So the first effort in 2015 included many regional stakeholders. Why now are only tribes being asked to vote? And why are tribes being asked to vote by mail instead of in person?
Why don't I pick up, Willie, with your comment about the streamlining and improving. So the answer to the question of why are only the tribes being asked to approve the draft constitution is to be a clean and simple path to recognition that the tribal governments have sovereign authority. And if they decide to work together to create a regional tribal government with sovereign authority, we believe that that's the best path to getting to an affirmative answer and also recognition from the federal government. So that is the reason why this approach is being taken. And then the fact that we're doing it by mail really is a consequence of COVID. That the inability to have direct face-to-face communications over the issue in person is just not possible right now. But yet the needs of the people are tremendous. And that further delay in moving forward to form a regional tribal government to do its best to help provide, frankly, important services like public health and safety can proceed as soon as possible.
Thank you. And Rob, if I could follow up with you, and I'd also like to ask this question of President Peterson. Will a regional tribal government impact tribal sovereignty? And would a tribe give up sovereignty if they vote in support of formation of a regional tribal government? Does a tribal member have to give up their enrollment in order to enroll in a tribal government?
Well, no, we should clarify that, be very clear that none of this interferes with tribal enrollment status, nor does it interfere with the status of a tribal government. In fact, the whole purpose of this is to strengthen the tribal governments with their ability to work together with one another. Right now, that mechanism doesn't really exist on a government-to-government basis. And so this is all about empowering, strengthening, and improving the quality of life for people of the region.
Yeah, I think, like Robert said, I fully agree with that. And I think if framed right in the incorporating documents, it should only build upon the strength of the sovereignty that you have now and broaden it and give a stronger voice in advocacy.
Thank you. President Peterson, if I could follow up, can you tell us how tribes and tribal citizens vote in regional government elections?
So in our region, the way Central Council is incorporated, every community has a delegate by population. So we have local elections, the tribal citizens in each community elect their delegates, and then their delegates are part of tribal assembly.
Great. And does that happen at one time during the year in particular? Is there a headquarters or a location where the votes happen?
Yeah, well, our headquarters, we're located in Juneau, and our election staff works, and they're actually our enrollment staff. And so they'll handle the elections, and they'll mail out a ballot to every enrolled tribal citizen of age, which is 18. And then they'll mail those back, and we'll tabulate them here.
Thank you.
Kristi, could I just add on to that? The discussion about forming a regional tribal government in many ways is just a historic function of all human beings to work together for common interests. And Yupik people, just as much as people, native and non-native, have always come together in times of crisis, of national defense, of common interest. And maybe it's just temporary, and it's not elevated to the form of government. But my nation, the Senecas, are one of the historic Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee that came together in our historic confederacy 500 years ago. And we'll take full credit, as we should, for another group of people called the American people, who formed a government called the United States of America, based on the idea that people should work together for common purposes. And, you know, we tend to think it worked okay for the Americans. I would recommend it's going to be great for the people of the YK Delta as well.
Kristi, if I can add, one of the things that I've heard President Peterson say, and other elected leadership actually many a time, and I think Rob in his capacity as president said the same thing for the Seneca Nation: if you don't use your sovereignty, you lose it. It's at real risk of losing it. And so what Klinketh and Haida did in Southeast and has done as a regional tribe is to express the existing tribal sovereignty that they and the tribes, the smaller tribes in their region, hold in theory. But if you have it in theory, it's really not worth anything other than a good feeling unless you can actually use it. And the federal government really does tend to prefer to work with a regional aggregation of natives or Indians in the delivery of services. That may be a good impulse on the part of the feds. It may be not so good, but it is an actual orientation of the feds. And so often Alaska village communities have been overlooked because it so seems to be too hard a challenge to serve them to the federal officials who are making those decisions. And so cooperating in terms of exercising your sovereignty can really bring added benefit to the people to be served if it's done in a coordinated and constitutional fashion, which Klinketh and Haida strives to do. And from what we can tell, the proposal here on the RTG similarly strives to do.
Kristi, if I can just add briefly, you know, there's 229 federally recognized tribes in Alaska right now. And the unfortunate reality is many of the voices are overlooked. And Phil's point of the regional tribe having, you know, I don't agree with it that they do this, but it is true that the government, the state and federal government, they want to look to fewer voices. And when you have that regional voice, then we can assure that those communities that might otherwise be overlooked aren't overlooked and have that voice because we are their government. They speak through us.
You know, and if I could add also, just the historical trajectory for you in Alaska is also rooted in ANCSA. You know, that ANCSA was the first mechanism for the Alaska Native corporations to bring people together formally and be recognized by the United States. 1990s, you know, tribal governments are finally recognized by the United States. Over this time period, you formed your nonprofits to provide services to work in conjunction with your tribes. And here we are at this moment when you really need to evolve to the next level, I would suggest, and to form the regional tribal government so you can build upon the successes that have occurred, you know, through tribal government, through nonprofits, and through the ANCs. And so it's a historic moment, and I believe and certainly recommend, you know, that this is an opportunity to really take it to the next level and seize that opportunity for the benefit of all the people of the region.
As a follow-up, you all know that the Yukon Kuskokwim Delta region is one of the most economically depressed in the state and in the nation. A lot of people are hungry for jobs. Can you tell us, would a regional tribal government create jobs? And I'd especially like to hear from President Peterson, what kind of a job would be created through a regional tribal government?
Well, of course, Klinketh and Haida administers services and programs. So some of those regional are like tribal assistance to needy families, our VPSO programs. And we compact with our smaller tribes that maybe not have the resources to administer some of those programs. But also, Phil made a really good point earlier that if you don't utilize your sovereignty, you know, it's not hardly worth the paper it's written on, so to speak. For me, this might seem controversial, but I say you're only as sovereign as you can afford to be. And so we've been able to utilize kind of our regional muscle into the economic arena to the point that we're competing with our ANCs for government contracting. Klinketh and Haida has a company now with over 1,500 employees worldwide that brings back dividends to our tribe and then to our villages because of that. We've also created local businesses and economic development. When I became president of Klinketh and Haida 6 years ago, we had about 190 employees. Because of our creation of local businesses, we have over 320 employees right now. I think we're probably at the largest we've ever been. And we're bringing back funding and resources that are unrestricted, that we can determine what exactly we can do with them and how and who we can serve with them. That's flexing that regional muscle, right? And unfortunately, I come from one of the smallest villages in our region, and we were able to do the same, but at a much smaller magnitude. Now, utilizing the strength of our regional tribe, we're able to do much more than we ever could have. And that's going to be a direct benefit to all of our villages. And I think right now the 320 employees, like 87% are tribal hire. And I'm very proud of the fact that my entire executive team, my COO, my CFO, my chief development officer, every one of them is a tribal citizen. We have 32,000 tribal citizens, so you can do the math. I mean, that's pretty impressive.
That's interesting. That's almost the same number of shareholders that Calista has. Can you tell us what are some of the issues or challenges that your regional tribe can help address in your region?
You know, again, I think that we have a ability to be able to advocate what our villages need in a louder, stronger way. I would not say more effective. Some of our villages are extremely effective, but you know, we are able to call meetings and ask for meetings, not only with our congressional delegation, but through them, we're able to have meetings with secretaries. You know, we've had the Secretary of Agriculture, the Undersecretary of Agriculture, Secretary of Interior. You know, we're able to get those meetings because when we say that we represent 32,000 tribal citizens, it's pretty impressive. I'm not sure how many YK would be. You guys would probably quickly rival us to be the largest tribe in Alaska. And you know what? I'm okay with friendly competition. My father's a Calista shareholder, so I'm kind of cheering you guys on anyhow.
Thank you. And is it true that the Central Council is in more than just Alaska? You have tribal members in other states?
Yeah, when we were formed, as Phil said, in 1934, it was actually born out of a lawsuit. And so it was represented all over. And so we have a delegation in San Francisco and Seattle, as well as Anchorage.
Thank you so much. Rob, specifically regarding the proposal to form a regional tribal government in the Yukon Kuskokwim, can you tell us what things the regional tribal government might be able to address in the YK?
Well, certainly there are restrictions actually contained in the interim tribal government document, just to make sure that we're recommending that the tribal governments themselves are all respected in their own internal authority. But there are some functions that are just naturally designed to be served by a regional tribe. And you could start with public safety, for example. Public safety is an expensive governing function, but one that requires trained officers, the development of appropriate laws, a judicial function, and it could really serve as a frontline service to improve safety for people in the villages. Another is natural resource protection. Animals don't respect boundaries. They go where they're meant to go, and having the ability to better eyeball and regulate your wildlife, your fisheries, your lands, to work in partnership with the federal government with respect to the federal lands, within the region. That's all a very well-developed path of self-governance that the federal government is welcome to working with tribal governments to address. And so only a regional tribe would have the ability to look from one edge of the historic territory to the other and say, we have to have a real regional policy and regulatory approach to this. And then lastly, I would just add, the response to COVID is a perfect example for needing a centralized government, to be able to corral resources, to work with various people, to be able to address where outbreaks are occurring. And if we've learned anything from this, not just in your region, but really throughout the world, is it takes a coordinated, responsible government approach to be able to do its best to help the people in any particular area. No one small government can do it on their own. And so that's what the regional government effort is really focused on, trying to address the functions that really can't be done by anyone else but the regional tribe.
Great, thank you so much. Walter, I'd like to hear from you next. What are some of the differences between the Association of Village Council Presidents, or AVCP, and a regional tribal government?
Sure. AVCP is it's a nonprofit chartered under the laws of the state of Alaska, very similar to what I mentioned earlier on the North Slope of Alaska with the Arctic Slope Native Association. AVCP is a nonprofit. It also serves as a tribal organization, meaning that if it, as is the case with AVCP, where it has received a supporting resolution from tribes that in the region to provide services for those tribal members, then it is able to do so. But the difference is, again, it is not a tribal government itself. It doesn't have any of the attributes of sovereignty. It is not recognized by the federal government as being a tribal government or a tribe. So it is. It has a role, potentially has a role, and would potentially have a continuing role in the region if and when the regional tribal government were established. Because as a tribal organization, it could continue to, with the supporting resolutions from the village tribes in the region, and also potentially a supporting resolution from the regional tribe, could continue to be the conduit to provide services that the federal government historically had provided.
Kristi, can I add on to Walter's comment there? Because it was said earlier by Phil that so much of what's happening in Washington is tied to the voice of tribal governments to be able to advocate for Native people. And I think both of us could attest that over the last 30 to 40 years, certainly the self-governance era, we've been around long enough to have seen it, live and participated in it. Tribes are as strong as they've ever been, whether you have a large resource base or not. The government is really wired to hear from tribal governments, government to government in a sovereign to sovereign relationship. And I think that has been to some disadvantage for Alaska tribes that have, again, just gotten to the game late in terms of federal recognition, have not had the same resource base, have had challenges in addressing lands issues and contracting issues. But this could really be a game changer in stepping forward as a regional tribe, as President Peterson has attested to, by really bringing together the voice of the people through the tribes in the region. And I think that what we would see if the regional tribal government was formed is a much, much stronger ability for your governments to be heard, your people to be heard in Washington, especially when it comes to resources and government policies in the United States.
Thank you. And as a follow-up to that, how might AVCP be impacted? As was mentioned, they are the nonprofit for the region. Would the regional tribal government replace AVCP?
Quick answer to that is no, but I'll let Rob elaborate on that with respect to the role of the RTG and potential, the potential impact that would have on AVCP and the role that it has and the services that it provides in the region.
Well, sure, Walter. I mean, the short answer is no, but yet the discussion is then available to figure out what's the best way to provide the service. If you have a regional government, only governments, for example, can provide law enforcement. public safety functions. A nonprofit could never do that. It could facilitate other governments to do it, but a regional tribal government would be able to provide that service directly. And I think that's where the opportunity exists. And so the new leadership of the regional tribal government, as they come into being, will have important questions to ask. We'll have to work with the tribes. We'll have to work with the nonprofits. We'll have to work with the ANCs to figure out what's the best way to conserve resources, to acquire new resources, to be able to fulfill important functions of government. And my guess is that will be a journey that will take, forever to find the right path, that will far outlive any of the people now living, to, like all people in a democratic society, try to figure out the best way to govern and provide services to the people.
Speaking of the regional tribal government, can it operate without US federal recognition?
I would say it could function in theory, more like a nonprofit, as a facilitator of the tribal governments. But ultimately, having the federal government recognize the regional tribal government will be very critical to the effort. To establish the government-to-government relation requires your neighbors, the state included at some level, to be a participant in recognizing the sovereign authority of the people of your region. And that too is a human quest of democracy. Sometimes governments are easily recognized, sometimes they're not. But again, even the United States had to fight for recognition in its early days, and so too all fledgling democracies. This one will be no different, and it will be important for the new leaders of the regional tribal government to take it on as their mission to gain that recognition of your people and your sovereignty.
Thank you. I'd like to hear also from Phil and President Peterson on that note. Before Congress intervened to restore Central Council's recognition, was the tribe able to operate in the early to mid 90s without that congressional step?
It was, but let me be clearer that until 1993, the BIA had grudgingly respected the right and role of the Central Council Klinketh Haida as a tribe. Central Council was the first tribe in the country to utilize the Buy Indian Act authority, for example, to enter into a contract with the BIA. No other tribe, lower 48 anywhere, did that before Klinketh Haida did. So BIA had a real spotty record of a very inconsistent record of treatment of Klinketh Haida. But then suddenly the Assistant Secretary in 1993 whimsically and arbitrarily yanked them off the list and made it very difficult for the tribe. It imperiled a lot of the funding streams. For example, tribal courts. While Klinketh Haida's had to battle and battle to get tribal courts respect and funding, when they were stripped off the list of recognized tribes, suddenly that took the air out of the wind, the wind out of the sails of their efforts at that time. And so whether it's public safety that Rob mentioned, whether it's courts protecting Native kids, whether it's revenue potential, which a nonprofit by definition does not have, but a tribal government does. And whether it's a territorial reach, which is particularly important in terms of resource management, especially in resource-rich Alaska, but everywhere. The notion of a tribal government is territorial, that there's an area of land, whether you own it or not, regardless of who owns it, over which you have some measure of sovereignty. And as we all know, power abhors a vacuum, and the state is well organized and well structured to move into any place where there is a vacuum, and where in a region there is no regional government other than the state by default. Guess who makes the decisions? So it's not to say we pick a fight or it's a battle. It's always a struggle. It's like a game, and we're on a playing field here. But if we don't field a team and go play the opposition on a particular issue, they're going to put the score on the scoreboard. And it's similarly with regional tribal government. I think if you don't fight that battle, you basically have written your own terms of surrender.
And, you know, to follow on what Phil said, Klinketh and Haida is inherently structured to take on some of these battles, and we've found ourselves, unfortunately, in litigation against the state of Alaska several times, and we continue to come out on top on that litigation. Whereas I think some of our village tribes might not have the wherewithal to fight those battles. I think it might have been Robert or somebody mentioned earlier, you know, animals don't know borders. When we talk about resource protection, it really takes a regional effort. We have to work together. And in our region, you know, it's anything from fish, salmon, to deer, wolves, and everything in between. And we are under constant pressure from outside entities on that. And so we're primed to be able to take on those fights.
That's terrific insight. Thank you so much. Back to the topic of federal recognition, can one of the attorneys on the phone talk us through the process of becoming federally acknowledged?
Sure. Yep. The recognition process can take a couple of different routes. You know, Phil and President Peterson have explained that in the case of the Central Council, that there was a legislative action, you know, that ultimately recognized, and that is available as well for the regional tribal government if need be. We also believe that the United States Department of Interior has inherent authority granted by Congress to be able to recognize a regional tribal government, which should, you know, be facilitated because it's being formed by regional tribes, by tribal governments. You know, so it's so close in terms of where you're at right now, because you have, you know, like the Kuskokwim Intertribal Fish Commission as having tribes coming together for purposes of tackling a government function. Fisheries issues is really just one more step to take that to a regional level and to take it into other areas of government responsibility. I've heard it many times from your congressional delegation, but other officials in Washington, they welcome working together with tribal associations, tribal governments, and a regional tribal government would fit into that category. And so I believe that there'll be open ears when the time comes, hopefully in the near future, for regional tribal government officials to be recognized by the United States for purposes of being able to serve your people.
If I can tag on to what Robert said too, you know, when you have these councils, one of the things is they're often looking for a tribe to kind of sponsor them to accept money, so and things like that often. And it's really hard, I think, when you don't have that regional tribe who can take that on. Then you end up pitting village tribe against village tribe when we should all be really singing from the same sheet of music.
President Peterson, maybe it'd be best to answer this question as well, or to start the conversation. Will federally recognized tribes in a region still be able to independently compact, and acquire federal funds if there's a regional tribal government in the region?
Yeah. So give an example. I come from the organized village at Kasan, is our village tribe. And we were one of the very few tribes in the beginning in the around 2000 to start government contracting. Previous, it had been all ANCs doing it. And so my tribe and a neighbor tribe partnered together, formed a company that's still in existence today, has government contracts all over the world, and again, brings money back to our villages. And that's perfectly in alignment with what Central Council is doing. In fact, we find that we kind of support each other here and there, and we consider ourselves relatives in the work we do in our companies.
And aside from procurement contracting that President Peterson mentioned, on the self-governance and self-determination side, Klinketh Haida also has a history of cooperating with IRA tribes in its region. When Congress confirmed the continuing recognition of Central Council by statute, the sponsors of the bill insisted that, and Central Council willingly agreed to this because it was longstanding regional tribal policy that where there is competition between an IRA tribe in the region and the regional tribe, Central Council, that Central Council would stand down and be supportive of the village tribe, not try to overwhelm and compete with them in the federal agency application process. And that has really worked very well from the beginnings of self-governance. The compact that Klinketh Haida signed with the Department of Interior had a place for a few of the tribes that said, we want to do this ourselves. And Klinketh Haida worked with them and basically facilitated with technical assistance their assumption of authorities that were by rights theirs. And so there was a long history precedent for that as a matter of tribal policy, which the feds wanted to enshrine in federal law, and the tribe willingly agreed to that. How the RTG decides to, walk through that particular field is totally up to RTG, but there is a model for doing that with Central Council in the Southeast.
Kristi, can I take us back to the process of federal recognition for just a moment?
Please.
I want to emphasize that federal recognition does not mean federal creation. The tribes are not creatures of the federal government. The federal government recognizes what exists because of custom, tradition, law that is created by the members of the tribe, or those who have formed that political group. And so it's a little bit of a, in terms of process, sometimes think of a chicken and egg, but it really isn't a chicken and egg. The chicken really does come before the egg. It's the political group that is formed by the tribal members, whenever in time that might have happened, whenever in history that that may have happened and come to evolve, and then the federal government will either recognize or not recognize, and there is a process that results in that recognition. But this is not a situation where, for example, in the YK region, where tribes or the tribal members in the region need to wait for the federal government to take some act to establish the regional tribal government. That's an action that is to be taken by the region, by the tribes in the region, and then part of their process after they have established the organization is to seek that recognition either legally or politically through the legislative process or the administrative process. But it is not something that they need to wait on the federal government in order for them to exist.
Speaking of political organizations, in Alaska, we don't have counties, but the communities can opt to organize under boroughs. Can you tell us what are some of the benefits of forming a regional tribe versus forming a borough? Well,
let me jump in just to start that one off, and because it's a good segue from my previous comments, and that is the borough, in fact, is a creature of the state government. It exists only as it is created under the laws of the state of Alaska. And as such, it is a political organization that is completely under the control of the state of Alaska, under the state as a state government. And because it is a creature of the state government, it is by law, by the Constitution of Alaska, is not going to be a native or tribal organization at all. It can, in fact, can have none of the attributes or features of a tribe or a tribal organization, or even of a native organization itself. So that's number one. Number two is that the boundaries of the jurisdiction of that borough, again, are going to be determined by the state. And the boundaries may very well be different than the jurisdictional boundaries of the borough may very well be different than what the tribes and the people, the native people in the region, believe would be optimal for their unified political voice. And in fact, could be much smaller, could be just a very small sub-portion of the region, or a sub-region. Then number three, the other, what we've learned from experience in Alaska with boroughs is that the laws of the state of Alaska are fairly well developed in how a borough can be created and put in place for a particular region, but they're almost non-existent in terms of how to uncreate a borough, when the funding source for a borough or the reason for a borough might come to an end or be eliminated, then the borough as an entity, and one that frankly has a momentum to its life because it's got borough officials, how to bring that borough to an end has proven to be very problematic in at least one other region in Alaska. And so it is an important consideration for those in the YK region who may be thinking about it. Rob, you might have thoughts specifically to, versus an RTG and the benefits in RTG versus a borough.
Well, I come at this from a couple of different perspectives. I mean, as a former tribal official, I pretty much, have always, gotten up every morning kind of fearing whatever the state or its local governments would do to natives. And so just the inherent distrust of a foreign system like that is really what kind of gnaws me now as an advisor and as an attorney. But try to view it, more objectively. I think the question is, if you're asserting your sovereignty, if you're asserting your control over your future, how best to do that? And isn't it better ultimately to keep the power and the authority and the choices in your own hands, in the hands of the people who are part of your own community of people, rather than give it to another government? And I think that whether it be creating a local government under Alaska state law, which could then allow non-Indians to have a legal voice in your internal business, is probably, frankly, more of a short-term, narrow appeal that over time very quickly would turn out to be the wrong decision, just in my view. And that doesn't mean that you can't have a working relationship with a state government or a borough as a sovereign tribal government. But I think at the end of the day, the goal is if your goal is to exercise your own inherent authority as a people and to do your best to serve all of the people of your region, then I just don't see how a borough fits into that equation at all.
Yeah, and I'd like to add, from the UPAT perspective, you know, I always come back to what I heard when I was growing up. One of the sayings was from an elder from the coastal communities that said, we shouldn't be too quick to follow the systems of the Western, they were referring to the United States and Alaska. You know, we've always been adaptable people, so we had no problems with taking on the gun and the other implements for making our hunting and fishing a lot more successful. But I always heard that other aspect of do not be so quick to follow or adopt the systems of the federal and state governments. Otherwise, it'll go to your identity directly. You know, translating, we were told that we would lose the ability to call ourselves UPIC or UPAT if we adapted the systems of the federal and state governments. So that goes into the core of our being, the borough, yeah, and that's why the participants in the 2015 resoundingly rejected that, one of the reasons why. And before them, it was our elders. You know, our elders had the opportunity to form a regional entity in the form of a borough, but they never did because they had that experience of self-governance already. And it went into the core of our ability to say that we were UPIC, UPAT, Shukpat, the real people. You know, our language group extends from Russia over in the Naukan Yupik to the Bering Straits, to the YK Delta, to Bristol Bay, down to the Chugach and the Kodiak Islands. You know, we can speak to each other, dialectal differences, yes, but we can talk to each other and understand each other. And we grew up on stories of my people on the Kuskokwim traveling over to the Daukan Yupik territory up beyond Diomede to go wrestling. I had a great grandpa from Kodiak, you know, so we had those stories that were instilled in us, telling us about our territory and how we work together in terms of keeping that territory. You know, we had laws, traditional laws and traditional governments that imposed those laws that said how we should do things and what we should not be doing. And they were transmitted orally. And that's what was broken, the transmission of those traditional laws and governments that we had, primarily resulting from the great death that we experienced, a loss of population that broke that teaching cycle. And then a lot of us having to go on to boarding school. That just compounded the issue of breaking that teaching that we traditionally had. So having a borough and having a regional tribal government does go into the core of being able to say, yes, I'm a UPIC or a UPAT or a Shukpat. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, President Guy. If the tribes of the YK Delta decide to form a regional tribal government, the newly formed tribe will need initial startup funding. Can we talk about some of the ways a regional tribe can generate revenue?
Well, Kristi, why don't I jump in there and try to provide just a brief overview. It does, you know, bear mentioning that Calista has offered to put forward initial seed funding to assist in the interim regional tribal government, but then Calista will step back from that process, and the tribal government will need to move forward with its own resources. one of the natural first steps would be to consider entering into a self-governance or self-determination contract with the United States to be able to provide some of the services that we've been talking about as part of the governing functionings of the RTG. There are other opportunities. As you know, there's a pretty significant development project at Donlin that is available for discussion. There's been a lot of possible mention of a payment in lieu of taxes to be able to support the regional tribal government. That's what governments do. They work with businesses in the region. They do their best to generate a revenue base. And so you can't even have those discussions, obviously, until you have a government formed. But it will, again, be an endless quest to generate the resources that you need. But President Peterson has also raised an important point as well, that his government started its own business and was able to pursue government contracting just as the ANCs had in the past. And I'm sure you've gone on, President, to have other businesses as well, even beyond the contracting. So it's a journey, but it starts with forming the regional tribe.
Yeah, I think government contracting is a unique opportunity. And again, utilizing and looking at your own resources, creating businesses. Klinketh and Haida looked at where we were expending funds. I can tell you one of the things that we noticed every year, we were contracting out hundreds of thousands of dollars for food services. So we quickly formed our own catering company and we started meeting our own needs. We spend money on security, so we formed our own security company. Take a look and see what those needs are in your surrounding area and meet those needs through economic development.
Rob, I'd like to circle back to something that you mentioned about Calista potentially providing some seed money for government operations for the first year of the RTG. Can you clarify? There's been some confusion about Calista's role in the process. Would the tribe fall under Calista, or is this an operation entirely of tribal governance that falls under federal law?
A regional tribal government, as we're discussing, is purely a function of the tribes. Calista has been fortunate to be in a position to provide some resources. For example, even just convening a meeting, as was the case in Anchorage 5 years ago. Calista's secondary mission is to provide opportunities for improving the well-being of the people of the region. But Calista, its shareholders are better off if there's a strong regional tribal government voice. But as the regional tribal government is formed, Calista will have no role beyond that process. The regional tribe will not be connected to Calista. It'll be a sovereign government that, if anything, will have a relationship to the other tribes of the region. And if the choice is made to not have a regional tribal government, Calista leadership has made it clear that they will walk away from the effort as well, that's not something that the tribes or the people of the region want, and it's not Calista's business to undermine that direction either. So one way or the other, Calista will move on and potentially be a partner and supporter of the regional tribe, or just move on to its other business.
Thank you for that clarification that Calista will not be associated with the regional tribal government. On a related question, is the regional tribal government proposal tied in any way to Donlin?
I'll start off and just say clearly, no, it's not. It's completely separate. Donlin is its own development project that's tied to Calista and the ANCs, the village ANCs that support it. It has nothing to do with whether the RTG moves forward or not. As mentioned earlier, it could provide an opportunity for some funding of a payment in lieu of taxes for the regional tribe, or not. If the tribal government does not want to pursue that line of funding, it doesn't have to. And so they're completely separate, they're unrelated. And the question about whether to form the regional tribal government can and should be made independently of how one feels about Donlin as a development project.
While we are on the topic, for those that are unfamiliar with the payment in lieu of taxes, can you talk about the PILT? What is a PILT?
A payment in lieu of taxes is a mechanism by which by which a potential taxpayer negotiates a payment to a taxing authority, to a governmental authority that stands in place of a direct tax or a taxing event. It's an agreement between the potential taxpayer and the taxing authority. And the notion there is that many times there will be a potential taxpayer that is not technically or legally subject to the tax, but nevertheless receives some services associated from the government entity or the government authority or the governing authority. And so it is a mechanism for that potential taxpayer to through a voluntary arrangement make payments to the governing authority to offset or partially offset or contribute to the costs of that governing authority in providing services. And so to bring it to a specific example that may be discussed, that has been discussed here, Donlin Gold Mine, the Donlin Gold LLC is an entity, and it would be receiving the benefits of and potentially services by regional tribal government. And as a way to defray or partially defray the costs of the RTG providing those services, which the Donlin Gold LLC would potentially receive the benefits of that, then Donlin Gold LLC could, again, it's an agreement, but could enter into an agreement with the regional tribal government to make payments to the regional tribal government, taking the place of paying taxes, but with a purpose of defraying the costs of providing services that would benefit Donlin Gold.
President Peterson, can you tell us, what do you think are the downsides to potentially forming a regional tribal government? What are some of the associated risks that you see?
I think, again, in the framework of the governing documents, you can mitigate all those. Any downside, I think really it's all about the upside, strengthening your region, bringing more opportunity, creating jobs, strengthening sovereignty, and really speaking with a more unified voice against those things that you all agree in commonality with.
Gunwashish, Koyana Masi, to each of you for sharing your insights today. And as we wrap up our call today, I'd welcome you to share any closing thoughts.
I'll go ahead. I think this is a big step for your region. I believe in sovereignty. I think you can strengthen your sovereignty of your villages. This is about everything we do should be about our future generations, our children, our grandchildren, down to your great-great-great-grandchildren. And this is laying that foundation that can really strengthen and make sure that your culture is protected, is fought for, and defended in a more meaningful and successful way. So I wish you the very best. I hope that you are able to come together and make a decision that you all agree is the best for your region, for your communities, and for your people.
Any other closing thoughts?
Yeah, this is Willie. I just want to thank President Peterson and the attorneys that are online to discuss the regional government effort. As I stated earlier, this is nothing new, and this was the hope of our elders when we started talking about the regional government. President Peterson is right. Our elders kept saying culture is important. The homeland that we live in needs to be protected. And education as well is very important, whether it's westernized or the knowledge of the elders during their time of survival in their homelands. In one of our forums that we met, we had an elder stood up to at the time, the Berger Commission, and he testified saying that, other countries such as Germany, France, and others have their own culture, their own language, and territory, and we're no different. And it made a big impact on me when he said that. We're just as strong as those nations as we are a nation. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Rob. I just wanted to thank everyone for the opportunity to participate in this important discussion and to encourage the people of the YK Delta region, to do your best to make your best decision. I was lucky as a citizen and a former president of my nation to have been part of a 500-year governing tradition under the Great Law of Peace. The Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, came together to work together for our betterment and to protect ourselves. I just wanted to show you, this is a small version of our Hiawatha belt, our treaty belt that reflects that promise that was made to one another. And when you look at all of human history and you look at the opportunities to work together, I honestly have to ask the question, I want to know where in the government's files did they ever encourage us to think we couldn't work together, or that we shouldn't work together, because that's the ultimate weapon against us, is to think that somehow we can do it by ourselves. And so you have an opportunity to restore, in my view, the natural state of things, to work together, to share your power with each other, and to go off and to fight the battles you need to fight to protect your people. So Yahweh, thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Be well and stay safe, and we will be in touch soon.